Hello, everyone. I'm Karen MacNeil, author of The Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter Wine Speed. And this is Napa Valley Sessions, a history of winemaking and, the way I think of it, a bit of winemaking in history. So thank you for being here, first of all. We're going to have a very exciting time. We've got some terrific wines to taste, and we're going to explore just what makes the Napa Valley's history so compelling. I encourage you to ask questions, as we always do. And let me begin by telling you who's here with me. Hugh Davies is the president of Schramsberg Vineyards and also Davies Winery. Bo Barrett is the CEO of Chateau Monolina Winery. Alicia Mondavi, co-proprietor of Charles Krug Winery, as well as Aloft. Mark Behringer, chief winemaker for Behringer Vineyards. And Oscar Renteria, CEO of Tres Perlas. I'm so looking forward to hearing from these vintners, but also tasting their extraordinary wines. But before we begin, because this is a session on history and history in the making, I thought it would be great to give ourselves some context. And so I've put together a group of photos that will take us for 5 minutes or so into the overall story of the Napa Valley. So let's pull up the map. Here it is. Here's the Napa Valley. As you can see, it's a tiny place. Bordeaux is 6 times larger than the Napa Valley. It's bordered on both sides by mountain ranges, the Mayacamas on the west and the Vaca on the east. In the north, where we are standing in this photo, is Mount St. Helena, which kind of looks like a volcano, but actually isn't one. And on the south there, you can see San Pablo Bay, which flows out into San Francisco Bay. Napa Valley makes 4% of all the wine in California, just 4%. But as we all know, it's here that some of the most delicious and structured and complex, not to mention age-worthy wines in the US are made. So it's important to point out, to me it's important to point out, that Napa Valley did not just appear on the scene in the modern era. It earned its reputation over more than a century and a half, and sometimes against all odds. What is fascinating, though, are the people who have found their way here. I've lived most of my life in New York City, although I live in the Napa Valley now. And what Napa Valley has, what the people here have, I think, are a gargantuan appetite for life. So let's take a very quick look back. California's history goes back more than 2 centuries to Spanish explorers and Franciscan missionaries who moved north from Mexico in the early 1700s and secured their new territory known as Alta, or Upper California, with a string of missions. There you see them, each a day's journey from the next. The cuttings these missionaries brought from Mexico were the Spanish grape Listan Prieto, and they were descended from those brought to Mexico in the 1500s by explorers such as Hernan Cortez. In Mexico and later in California, Listan Prieto had come to be known simply as Mission, after the missions where the grape was planted. But as the 19th century dawned, California settlers also began planting small vineyards, all initially based on Mission alone. Here in the Napa Valley, the first commercial vineyard was planted in 1938 or 1939 by a North Carolina trapper and homesteader named George Yount. Yountville is named after him. Yount planted grapes, specifically Mission vines, that he got from General Mariano Vallejo, who had been the Mexican commander in California, because California at the time still belonged to Mexico. It was only in 1848 that Mexico ceded California to the US government. The next year, an event happened that jump-started the entire California wine industry, especially in Napa Valley. In 1849, gold was found in the Sierra foothills, a few hours north of Napa. The gold rush had an extraordinary impact on the development of the wine industry. In the 2 years from 1848 to 1850, San Francisco alone went from 800 inhabitants to more than 25,000. The men who came to strike it rich in California, of course, were poor men, and most of them did not become wealthy. But with no money to return to Europe or the East Coast, they turned to the occupations that many of them knew best: farming and grape growing. Virtually overnight, Northern California had the two entities you need to start a wine industry. One, a huge pool of skilled viticultural labor, and two, an enormous market of people who wanted to drink. Poised just about halfway between the gold counties to the north and the saloons, bars, brothels, and boarding houses of San Francisco to the south, Napa Valley was perfectly positioned to benefit. Grape growing boomed, and better tasting Zinfandel began to take the place of Mission, along with some other hardy grapes like Petit Syrah and Carignan. Some of Napa Valley's iconic wineries were founded at this time, including Charles Krug in 1861, Schramsberg in 1862, Behringer in 1876, Inglenook in 1879, and Chateau Monolina, originally known as the A.L. Tubbs Winery, in 1882. There were just over 140 wineries here by the late 1880s. And in all the excitement, no one could imagine what would happen next. Phylloxera had been destroying the vineyards of Europe for 2 decades at this point, but no one anticipated that it would circle the globe and come to California, but it did. In the early 1890s, the insect destroyed vineyards up and down the state, including Napa Valley. For the vineyards at the time, of course, were all grown on their own Vitis vinifera roots. The 1890s were also a terrible time financially in the US. But phylloxera and the financial crisis were just the beginning. World War I began in 1914, Prohibition in 1920, the stock market collapsed in 1929, and World War II began in 1939. Napa descended into a kind of dark ages. Slowly over the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Napa Valley got back on its feet, but it was a difficult process. The affinity for fine wine was lost. Historical traditions and winemaking knowledge were so interrupted, they too were largely lost. And scientific research came to a dead halt. Even the enology department at the University of California at Davis was shut down. The 1960s, though, saw all sorts of new energy. Many of the vintners who started at this time were extraordinary individuals, successful, wealthy, strong-minded, highly educated, intelligent, and very entrepreneurial. Collectively, they were a powerhouse of ambition and drive. This is when both Robert and Peter Mondavi began making extraordinary wines separately for the first time. This is when the Trefethens came, the Chapelets, the Davies of Schramsberg fame. Plus, ambition and drive were not limited just to would-be vintners who started in the 60s. The Bracero program of guest farm workers had begun after World War II, and by the early 1960s, men like Salvador Renteria, who had been a barber in his native Mexico, came and slowly built vineyard management operations that are some of the most important in the Napa Valley today. For most of the 60s, the vast majority of wine made was cheap and sweet, but already in the 1960s, Napa Valley was carving out a focus on fine wine and on terroir. In the early 1960s, a man named Joe Heitz came to the valley too and made the first famous vineyard designated wine, Heitz Martha's Vineyard, which has had legendary status for the last 50 years. But when it was released in 1966, Heitz Martha's Vineyard was $7 a bottle, an astronomical price at the time, since Heitz's regular Cabernet was only $1.99 a bottle, the standard price for a good bottle of Napa Cabernet at the time. Before the 60s ended, however, a landmark zoning ordinance was passed by the Napa County Board of Supervisors. In 1968, Napa County formed the Agricultural Preserve, the first one in the United States. It severely restricted commercial activities and designated agriculture as the highest and best use of the land. There were no shopping malls on this land in 1968, and today, more than 50 years later, there still aren't. But finally, I want to talk about the spark that ignited the modern era, the 1970s. As the 60s rolled into the 70s, more affluent and successful people arrived, people with a gargantuan passion for life. A back to nature movement was happening in America, and many of these people saw an opportunity to live closer to the land. An astounding number of entrepreneurial families arrived at this time. The Novaks of Spotswood, Joseph Phelps, Jack Capebread, Bill Harlan, Dan Duckhorn, the Schaefer family, the Barretts of Chateau Monolina, the Duncans of Silver Oak, and on and on. Napa Valley was now on a roll. And for the last 40 years, it's been moving at warp speed. Today, there are 475 physical wineries in the Napa Valley, 95% of which are family owned. So now let's turn to our vintners. We'll get to the history, each of you vintners, we'll get to your history in a minute, but I want to begin by asking a sort of bigger question. And I want to start with Hugh and Bo, if I can. I want to ask both of you, and Hugh, I want to start with you. What do you believe has been the most important event in the Napa Valley thus far, in all of its history? What's been the most important thing that's happened? Hugh?
Well, I think perhaps the one thing that allows us to continue, the one thing that allows us to be here is the land. Without the land, and you alluded to that, without the land, we wouldn't be able to farm. We wouldn't have land that would be farmable. And so in some ways, I think that moment in 68, when the Agricultural Preserve was established, that established that a vineyard region would be here for a long, long time to come. And it may be hard for folks that aren't here to understand that, but in a state where we lose about 30,000 acres of agricultural land every year, the 33,000 acres that are in the Ag Preserve are pretty viable to our effort. And so that initial effort allowed for other the passage of other ordinances. We have ag watershed lands, we have conservation easements. I could go on and on, but that was really the initial step that protected the land, and I think that was really key.
Yeah, it was certainly revolutionary and remains revolutionary. But what would you say has been the most important moment?
Backing up, Hughes, it's true. You have to put in a time machine. So I'll get to my answer in a sec, but there's a letter from Alfred Tubbs, our founder, to Leland Stanford back in the 1890s when he was encouraging Stanford to put his university here in Calistoga. And I think that was one. So that's actually like that. Other than that, we'd be, Silicon Valley, and maybe they'd be growing grapes down there. So that was one. But I would say for the all American wine industry I'd have to go with the one pivotal thing with Prohibition, which the teaching 3 generations of Americans to drink booze and beer and spirits was a really tough thing, because I think absent Prohibition, Napa Valley would have been where we are now through the entire period, even through World War I, World War II. You see how Burgundy and Bordeaux, those guys all survived, the Nazis invading and stuff. But I think Prohibition would have to be the one pivotal thing that really killed American viticulture, because you can't move your vineyard. You can make beer anywhere. You can make spirits up in any hillside. You can be a moonshiner. But it basically taught 3 generations, and it was like my father didn't drink wine until he was a successful attorney in the 60s, and really and causing the center of American viticulture to move from Napa, Sonoma, the North Coast to Modesto. You know, by as late as 1972, the center of American viticulture is Modesto with the Gallo brothers. So, and I give them a huge amount of credit for restarting the quality industry in California, but I'd say Prohibition.
Yeah, oof. It certainly destroyed the beginning culture of wine in America for, as you say, decades. But I think we're back. Let's talk about what's happening right now that's making history. So I want to go to Oscar, Alicia, and Mark. Oscar, let's start with you. What's happening now? Do you think that's making history?
Well, I would have to say, since the Bracero program, the late 50s, and when my father and my mother came here from Mexico, I would say that the migration of Mexicans to Napa Valley and the quality standards that are expected in Napa Valley that are set are pretty high. And I think that's on the back of migrant farm workers. The American success story of people coming here, working hard, realizing the opportunities that they had, and the movement of grape growers and grape growing, because you have to have land, you certainly have to have folks to work that. And I think the migrant farm workers and really the pride of ownership of working in the vineyards to those standards is, I think, a big deal. Latino winemakers and grape growers in the vineyards. For me, that would mark the start of what I would see as a pretty significant era.
Yeah, a very big shift. UC Davis right now has done some very interesting analyses of how Latino workers have moved into greater and higher levels of management, and both Latino men and women. It's quite an enormous shift. Alicia, what would you say is happening right now that will, when we look back, we'll say, in 2020s, this was a very important phenomenon.
I was fortunate being fourth generation and having had my grandfather in my life up until the age of 33, and heard all the historical stories and what challenges they faced back then, and looking through going, a bottle of wine cost $1, $2, and now we're averaging $60 and higher for the Napa Valley Cabernet. But one thing that has always been passed down from generation in my family is that we're first and foremost farmers. And to pinpoint and add on to what Hugh had, we would not have an industry if we didn't take care of the land. Some of the processes that are in place and that we're continuously educating ourselves on and trying to better understand and keep at the forefront is protecting the land and managing it in a way that we can pass it down from generation to generation. And some of the programs that have recently been implemented with the help of Napa Valley Vintners is Napa Green programs, fish friendly, programs like that, just so that we can make sure that the land is taken care of. And then we're living it also. One of a huge trying time right now and everyday challenge that we're all facing is the current situation with COVID. As an industry, we're having to completely rethink the wheel, and unintentionally we've been forced to pivot our business models and plans, and in a way it's challenging everybody, and what that might look like for our restaurant partners and our retail accounts, and what that might look like for the smaller wineries versus some of the larger wineries, and also our industry where we've always welcomed visitors. It's drastically changed. So of course we're right in the midst of it, and we won't know how it's going to look at the end of it. We never do, but that's going to be, honestly, today, one of the biggest pivotal moments that we're experiencing right now.
Yes, it is. No doubt COVID will be something that we will all look back on. It is good to know how wine is, though, providing solace and connection during these times. Mark, what would you say is happening right now in the Napa Valley that is kind of history in the making?
Well, I think something that we've been moving towards even in the last 5 to 10 years is becoming even more noticeable now is advancements in technology, things that are adding more automation to the processes, having more remote control of different operations, and things like mechanical harvesting in the vineyards. As Oscar was talking about earlier, we had this great talent pool of labor for so long, but it's getting more and more challenging, especially with COVID. And we are starting to find ourselves more dependent on mechanization, automation, things like that. And we've been working on it for several years on our site. And a lot of it has to do also with another piece of that, which is sustainability. All of us are multi-generational, and we want to see this place as good or better than we left it when we leave it to our next generation. So we're doing a lot of projects around using less energy, around cooling in our refrigeration systems, using more solar power, using water capture devices in order to retain more water that falls on our surfaces, and also smart watering irrigation systems out in the vineyard that are putting down the right amount of water into the vineyard rather than just doing it because anecdotally we think it needs it today. And seeing all of those advancements come together, we had a lot of these things because they were kind of cool, they were kind of fun at first, but we're realizing as we're going through this, they're almost becoming necessities. And it's going to be our future if we're going to be able to thrive through these kind of situations and these challenges between wildfire seasons, pandemics, and everything else that might be thrown our way from one year to the next.
Yeah, we've got lots of questions rolling in. Thank you, everyone who's listening. I want to get, though, first to just a brief history from all of you of your wineries before we roll into our tasting and these questions. I should add to Mark's comment that the University of California at Davis has built a so-called winery of the future that requires absolutely no water at all. It uses just simple rain water for an entire year of sustaining itself, and no electricity either. There are very big technological changes ahead for the wine industry, for sure. But let's talk about history for a minute, your specific histories. Alicia, I want to start with you because at Krug, Charles Krug began in 1861, and your great-grandfather, Cesare, an immigrant from Italy, bought it in 1943, reportedly for $75,000. That must have been a huge gamble, though. That was a lot of money back then, and it was a big winery. Tell us quickly the story.
Yeah, so my great-grandfather, Cesare, they actually ended up in Virginia, Minnesota from Italy. Started in the mines and quickly decided that he needed to get out of the mining industry and acquired the local grocery store. So our history goes beyond the purchase of Charles Krug in 43. Actually in 1919 is about the time that he started as a local grocery owner, started getting shoulder tapped to source fruit for all the local Italian families to produce their household wines. So it was through Prohibition that his company thrived, and he realized there was a necessity to continue with the wine industry. So he was finding that the best fruit during that time he was sourcing from California, and ultimately started a trucking business and was trucking fruit back and forth, and eventually picked up the family and relocated them to the Napa Valley. At that time, he invested in sunny Santa Lena, which is today called Maryvale Winery. And then a few years later, the purchase of Charles Krug happened. And so that was 140 acres. I understood, I never got the opportunity to meet him, but I understood he was a man of few words, but very intelligent. And when he spoke, everyone listened. So he noticed early on the demand for grapes and wine and the potential of the industry. And so my family grew its roots from there, and we're fortunate to say Charles Krug is still family owned and operated by my 3 sisters, myself, and our 2 cousins, and our uncle and her father. So we're all involved in the business to some extent or another. And now we own about 850 acres in Napa Valley between Carneros, Yountville, St. Helena. Hall Mountain is our most recent acquisition. And we're very fortunate that my grandfather invested in property back in the 50s and 60s. So
and 1 year after Charles Krug began, Hugh, Schramsberg was founded, one of the first hillside, or perhaps the first hillside winery in the Napa Valley. And while Krug was a Prussian, Jacob Schramm was German. Tell us that story, Hugh.
So Jacob and Anna Schramm would arrive in New York City in 1842, and 20 years later they started transfer. But interesting to think of 16-year-old German immigrants coming to the United States with nothing, right? They had never heard of the Napa Valley at that moment in time, but they had aspirations. And eventually would make their way to here. My understanding is that both Krug and Schramm worked with the Buena Vista Winery in Sonoma, as that was established in 1857, and then a little later would venture for the north and establish their respective wineries here in Napa Valley. The German family would continue with the winery. They dug caves that were pretty well established actually in the 1800s. So I thought I'd park myself in tunnel number 2 here. So you can see behind me, this cave was dug with hands, with picks and shovels back in the 1800s. Hard volcanic rock would have been quite a challenge. But they would make still wines at that earlier time period, both red and white wines. Eventually Prohibition would shut the winery down. The Schramm family would sell the property. It was bought and sold a few times. My parents would then come in the 1960s, as you alluded to earlier, revive this place, and their focus would be on bottle fermented sparkling wine. They're really the first producers in the US to use Chardonnay and Pinot Noir to do traditional method sparkling wine. And so that's what we've done now for 55 years. Hard to believe it's been that long. Looking forward to our 56th harvest that will come up. As Alicia was alluding to, there have been some other products that we've produced. So we now have a Davies winery as well, where we make our red wines. Our home property here on Diamond Mountain was ultimately determined to be best suited for Cabernet Sauvignon, as we're working with the Carneros district and other cool coastal sites here in Northern California on the sparkling. And so we have this Davies brand. It's pretty cool to do red wines with our featured J. Davies Cabernet being from our estate vineyards here. Interesting, I'll throw a plug to Oscar. We do a little work with his Renteria 360 vineyard down in Oakville. So it's a small world here. We're enjoying working with generations that we're in the past our predecessors worked together as well. Pretty cool. Our first vineyard, as you mentioned, 65 Blanc de Blanc, was actually made at the Charles Krug Winery by Peter Mondavi. He made that first Chardonnay for us that we would then bottle here and store into these caves.
Yeah, and right at this time too, of course, the Behringer brothers, another, both of whom were also obviously German, came and built the stunning Rheinhaus a couple of years later. Like Schramsberg, Behringer was built up against the Mayacamas, so the caves could be built into the hillside. Mark, tell us about the Behringer brothers.
Sure. The history of my family goes back, or at least the California part of it, into the 1860s. It really goes back to where they grew up in the town of Mainz in Germany on the Rhine River, where they actually were part of the wine industry there as well. The eldest brother, Frederick, by 6 years, immigrated to the United States first to the New York area, and was actually in the brewing industry, importing malt, barley, and hops down from Canada into the eastern seaboard. He got his younger brother to come over and give him a hand with that. So Jacob came over and went to work with his brother, but realized really quickly he wanted to get back into winemaking. He was an accomplished winemaker in Germany. And so he took a ride on this new invention called the Transcontinental Railroad and found his way west with a lot of other people that were looking for gold still. But he took a different turn and ended up here in the Napa Valley and actually got a job working with Charles Krug. He was the cellar master there for about 6 years, and eventually saved up enough money, and with the help of Charles, was able to acquire the neighboring property right next door. It was a heck of a value at the time. It was about 215 acres and paid about $14,500 US for it.
Oh my goodness.
Current-
It's just heartbreaking to hear that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Pretty good investment. But,
Yeah.
you know, Jacob went to work to build a winery. He didn't really have much funds beyond that. His brother had all the money back in New York. So he encouraged his brother to come out and give him a hand and really invest in the site. And they were able to create a business together called Behringer Brothers. And that started in 1876. They set about digging caves by hand, building the first gravity flow winery in Napa Valley into the hillside so they could actually take advantage of the hill and crush the grapes on the top floor and allow it to cascade down into the storage cellars below. Later, Frederick got the itch and came out too. He finally moved himself out here permanently and built this beautiful mansion, the Rhine House, which I am currently sitting in his study. It was completed in 1883. So then, of course, eventually, as we talked about earlier, Prohibition happened. We're actually one of the very few wineries that stayed open during Prohibition and continued to be owned by the family. And we made it through that time, continuing to produce wine for the church, for sacramental wine, and also for medicinal purposes. And we like
Right.
there was a lot of sick and religious people during Prohibition. So
That's right. Yeah.
really in business.
It was a good time to both be religious and occasionally sick, at least once a week, or as long as your prescription didn't run out. Bo, talk to us about Chateau Monolina. I mean, it's well known, of course, for its Chardonnay, being the Chardonnay that won the Paris tasting of 1976. But the winery was built more than 100 years before that. Tell us about Tubbs, who founded it.
Okay, so yeah, so these are actually, so Alfred Tubbs, they're actually two American brothers, Alfred and Hiram Tubbs. During the age of sail and the mining days, they started a rope factory. You might have seen it down at Fisherman's Wharf. Tubbs Cottage is a famous building down there. And so they were already, they were rope manufacturers from the East Coast. They moved to San Francisco because they basically had a monopoly in the East Pacific for making rope, with all these sailing ships and all these mines and all these farming and the growth in California. So they became tycoons. You know, they were buddies with Leland Stanford and, you know, Crocker and all those, the big four. And so Tubbs, you know, he sees the Behringers and those guys getting going, and he says, well, I'm going to do that too. So he's actually one of the first. It's kind of what you see nowadays, people with, you know, software money or, you know, tech money moving up and buying big properties. He essentially bought everything north of our road, Tubbs Lane. So he had a giant place up here, which is now Chateau Monolina. So in 1882, he planted his vineyards. He built his cellar because it takes, you know, makes sense. He starts building a stone cellar. We don't know who designed the front of the chateau. It's been credited to Hampton McIntyre, but that's not true. When we did our National Registry of Historic Places, this is not a McIntyre building. He's a famous Napa Valley architect, or, you know, stone building builder, did Angle Nook and, you know, Farniente and stuff. So anyway, he's very successful, and because he's like well funded, because you think about how Hugh and, you know, the Crook guys started, they were farmers and they didn't have a lot of money. Well, this guy came in with a lot of money. So he builds this really fancy state-of-the-art chateau as a winery, 2 stories, gravity flow, had a winemaker from France, sent one of his sailing ships off to France to get his cuttings and all that, you know, good stuff. The guys, you know, like we see, that could come in and buy everything for their fancy new winery. This is what our guy did. So anyway, he built a, you know, state-of-the-art cellar, 1880s style, stone thing facing north, and plants 100 acres of vineyards, which is now the Monolina estate. And so he goes along, and that was the A.L. Tubbs winery. It was very successful. By 1892, it was actually producing more wine than the Behringer brothers. So, and he also started the co-op the first co-op, because in those days, I don't know how much time we have, but the 2 merchants in San Francisco were kind of ripping off the growers here, because they would always sell it bulk to San Francisco, then they'd water it down. So he actually started the Napa Valley Co-op to protect the prices for all the farmers in Napa Valley. So we're the winery number 6 that, you know, Hoxie's got now, the co-op. That was actually invented by Alfred Tubbs. So he does good. He gets older. Prohibition comes along. And then Monolina becomes a ghost winery. It did run, so it's A.L. Tubbs Winery till Prohibition. So his grandson, Chapin Tubbs, makes a go of it in 1932, but by the beginning of World War II, he's out of business, and Monolina becomes a ghost winery, and it's abandoned. It's a dirt floor still, the roof collapsed, and we got here. My dad was an attorney in Southern California, Irish. My grandparents were Irish immigrants. My other grandfather was a Norwegian wheat farmer in eastern Montana. There was no agriculture in my background whatsoever. I grew up on the beach in Palos Verdes, California, and I moved to Calistoga in 1972 when I graduated high school with my family. So my mom and dad, our family, my dad put together a group to buy Chateau Monolina and reestablish it. And all the 100 acres of vineyard, there was not a single vine of Cabernet here. There was all kinds of stuff, Oscar like this, Sauvignon, Vert, burgers, a lot of Alicante Boucher. All the Prohibition varieties were here. We did have Zinfandel and Petit Syrah and a little bit of Mourvedre, which was always an interesting one. But anyway, so we had to replant it, and so to pay for it, and this is before Cabernet and Chardonnay are the king and queen of the world. In Napa Valley, there was more Riesling being grown in Napa than Chardonnay. It was really, the McRae's up at Stony Hill and a few little Chardonnay famous vineyards, but nobody knew what was going to be the grape up here, except for we knew that Cabernet was going to be right for this property. So we started in 72 making 4 wines, which my dad, not having a lot of background, he says the great wines of the world are Riesling, Chardonnay, Cabernet, and the Rhone. Well, we didn't go with the Rhone varieties, went Zin, but that's in 1972. We've been making Riesling, Chardonnay, Cabernet, and Zin. The Riesling and Chardonnay were basically cash flow projects to get the Cabernet vineyard established. Then along comes 73. I started working in the cellar. That was my second year. I was living up in Snowbird by that time, and in Idaho Falls. And then when I was out of money, I come and work in the vineyard and cellar, summer and fall. So then 76, Paris Tasting Spurrier puts that together. He comes over because, in California, if you get in your time machine, we were actually selling pretty good. I think Hugh and Alicia would agree that California wines were really strong in LA, San Francisco. The provincialism for Americans, the wine's starting to be drunk in California, but we couldn't make any inroads on the national market. Nothing was happening. Only good wines were made in Europe, and we couldn't sell in Boston, New York, DC, And then the Paris Tasting comes, and that's what it was. That everything was here in California. We had the people with the dream. We had the reestablished vineyards. We had wineries with adequate equipment, new barrels, new tanks, that 1972 boom. So basically everything's here. It's just this big pot, this gel is ready to go. And then think that one drop of the Paris Tasting just catalyzed it, and off we went. And so.
Yeah. Well, let's hold that story there, because I want to get to Oscar. I will say, though, that you're absolutely right. In the 1970s, I remember as a journalist, the leading whites in New York City were Vouvray and Sancerre. And when people said, there's Chardonnay from California, in any restaurant in New York, people thought, who needs Chardonnay from California? We have Vouvray, we have Sancerre. That's what you drank. Or maybe a glass of champagne before dinner. But Oscar, we want to go to you because your family's story is so heartwarming. And you mentioned the American dream. It certainly is a great example of the American dream. Your father, Salvador, who is a barber, comes and begins working here in the fields, but eventually builds a vineyard management company that is going strong today. Tell us the story.
Yes. So actually, it started with my mother. She came here in 1952.
Of course, it started with your mother.
It has to start with the moms for sure. She came in 52 with her 7 brothers and sisters to work in the vineyards in Napa Valley at the age of 13, and my father in 1962 at the age of 23. And my father came straight from the bus from San Diego directly to where the Rutherford Grill is now. It used to be called the Handy Store. His brother invited him here because he was through the Braceros program in the late 50s. And these drones of families came from Mexico. My dad met my mother at the Rutherford Grill, the Handy Store. The first day he arrived, they got married 4 years later. But all the families that were coming here were looking for this opportunity to work in the fields. And my father, he had great work ethic, was recognized when he first worked in 62 at Sterling, and in 68 was given the opportunity to develop the first vineyard, being of Mexican descent, called Three Palms. That was his launch. And then in the early 70s, he was recognized by other winemakers. And then in 1982, he was able to go on to a 72, sorry, with a vineyard management company, and then be really exposed to working, what he would say, with Untitled Chapter BV, when they developed a few vineyards alongside Untitled Chapter, because he taught my father the viticultural side of what my father already knew, which is the practical side, and together they really developed a lot of different methods. But my father was well known when he retired in 1987. When I went to his retirement party, the giants of the Napa Valley, the pioneers, were there, and really gave my dad accolades for, I would never take my shears out in front of Salvador run of vine, because he knows how to prune, he knows how to do all the work. It's just like a barber, he had this craftsmanship and this pride. But what they gave him a lot of kudos for was his ability to bridge the cultural gap, to find pride and ownership of doing the work. At this time in the 60s and 70s, people were developing quality standards. And then he started his management company, and it was just a wonderful thing to see. I have 14 aunts and uncles in Napa Valley. I have 36 first cousins. We all lived in St. Helena. I was born in 1962 at the St. Helena Sanitarium Hospital. And then shortly after that long after that, came to work for my father when I graduated from college. And I did so because he asked me to come help him start his own management company. But he had all the roots. And it was an easy decision to make, even though I had a degree in finance and was about to make a lot of money. But I came home to work for my father, and for the first year and a half, worked on driving equipment. But I had a lot of pride working for my mom and my dad. My mother actually was my crew boss when I worked. And back then, if you were a son of a migrant farm worker, you would work at the age of 12 or 13. But I knew nothing different until I really got into high school. And then my mother embedded in me how important it was to go off to college, and so I did. It came back, and when I took my father's management company over in '95, still the ambassador of our management company and our wine brand. But I really looked for a way to separate ourselves, or at least add value, and that was to make wine. So in '97 we started making wine. So that I can actually learn. And that was really great for clients that we manage, Michael Madavi's and the Rombauer family, Duckhorn, and such, and a few others. It was really just a pride of ownership, and really to continue what my father had started, being a pioneer, along with a lot of other folks in the industry. So started making wine to understand the full circle of what was important about Napa Valley.
Yeah, and understanding that full circle is so critical. I mean, there is no other industry that requires so many talents in seemingly opposing directions. You need finance, right? But you need to be a farmer at the same moment, and you need to be a brilliant marketer, and you have to be an incredible winemaker. It's quite an industry in that regard. Thank you, Oscar. Let's taste the wines, though, because we still have questions rolling in. Hugh, we're going to start with your Carencia, because, and let me hold up this bottle of Schramsberg Carencia. The light is a little bit, there we go. There it is, better.
That looks good.
Okay, good. I can open my refrigerator any night of the week and count on a bottle of Schramsberg being in there. They make refrigerators that way, right? Now, don't they make refrigerators with a spot that says the Schramsberg goes here? I think they do. So let's everybody, we always want to taste each other's wines. We're hoping you've got a glass, all of our viewers have a glass as well of Schramsberg. If not Carencia, then another Schramsberg wine. But Hugh, tell us a little bit about this name and what Carencia means.
So the Carencia word is a beautiful Spanish word that relates to the longing to be in that place that you call home, or that real love for that place that you call home. And we have been producing this particular wine since '98. My dad passed away in '98. And we established a foundation in his name And then with that, we started producing a wine that would help us generate proceeds for the foundation. The foundation is dedicated to the long-term preservation of ag lands and agriculture in Napa, and I can bore you with those details. But yeah, querencia, it comes from the Spanish verb querer, which people may think of as te quiero, I love you, but it's an offshoot of that word querencia. So pretty cool.
Mm. It's a beautiful, beautiful
Really nice.
wine.
Yeah, I like this.
Do you want me to tell you a little bit about the wine itself?
Let me ask you, it's totally dry, isn't it?
It's a dry wine, yeah, very much of a brut style. This rosé is might be interesting for some of the winemakers to think of as well. There's actually 74% Chardonnay. Oh, but it's a rosé wine, right? Okay, it's rosé. We only need 26% more the red to work its way into this blend, and so there's a really crisp, charred nature to the Chardonnay. It's a low alcohol wine, about 12.5% alcohol. And then the juice, the brightness of berry obviously is coming from the small additions of Pinot Noir that are crafted first as base wines and then blended in.
Right. Hugh, we have a lot of questions that are about the impact of global warming on Napa Valley grapes. And since you specialize in sparkling wine with Schramsberg, perhaps you are the logical person to ask this because, of course, sparkling wine, you have to have that real spinal column of crispness and freshness in the wine. Are you, how concerned are you as the climate continues to warm?
Well, I think we've all got to be concerned, right? I mean, this is, and this is our livelihood as well. So we've taken steps to become a certified green winery. We work with certified green vineyards, et cetera. And we continue to improve and move down that track. Relative to what we've seen over the 55 years that we've been doing this, definitely as we've evolved, we've moved into cooler areas, frankly, where there weren't so many vineyards back in the 60s and 70s, like the Carneros. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, there were hardly any plantings in the southern part of the valley, considered too cool, right? It didn't work as well for the Cabernet. It didn't work as well for some of the varietals that were more popular at that time. And the yields can sometimes be a little low in these cooler pockets, can be more challenging, mildew pressure, et cetera. But as we've evolved with this, we've gotten better and better as you would understand, working with these cooler sites where the harvest might be a little later, it takes a little more time to mature, and you retain higher levels of natural acidity. Why is the Carneros cooler than, say, the Calistoga or St. Helena area where I live? Is that you have the bay. You have the bay, which is an extension of the Pacific Ocean. It's 60 degrees all year round, and so that changes things dramatically. And it's interesting to think, you can go from a Champagne or Burgundy-like location and drive 30 minutes and you're in a Bordeaux-like location. Very, very different, the different pockets of the Napa region and then the broader North Coast region around it.
It's very important to remember that California has more than 800 miles of coastline, and that vineyards are like pearls dotted down the coast, and proximity to the ocean or to ocean influences is critically important. I think I know even when I lived in New York, when I imagined California, I probably imagined something more like the Central Valley, where lettuces and strawberries, et cetera, are grown. But California, its proximity to the ocean is a very important factor in its future, to be sure. Let's go to Beau's wine. Thanks, Hugh.
If I could, is just the ocean, the Pacific Ocean is also really deep. And so as we go just a few miles off the coast, all of a sudden at 7,000 feet deep, boy, that water down at the bottom of the ocean, it's dark down there and it is very cold. And we have not yet seen, knock on wood, I've got a barrel top here, we've not seen that much of an increase in the ocean temperature. It's not to say that it won't happen or couldn't happen, isn't coming, but with that, there has been some stability to the ambient temperature in those pockets of our coastline that are close to the ocean.
Yeah, important point. All right, let's go to the Chardonnay. I want to, not just any old Chardonnay, Chateau Monolina Chardonnay. And here is
74 bow that you poured for us. Wasn't that the one that won the Paris tasting?
this is the actual bottle that won the Paris tasting. Bo, thank you for giving this to me. It was just such a good guy.
That's
Yeah.
it. You and the Smithsonian Institution have a few of the last models, you know.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. So our Chardonnay, we started, again, this is back in 1972, 73. There is no American viticultural area. So our first winemaker was an ex-BV guy, worked for Telegraph named Mike Gergich. Everybody knows Gergich Hills. And so he was our winemaker. And he was coming out of BV and Mondavi. He was a very experienced guy. And he put together the Chardonnay from the best vineyards he could find. So one was on Oak Knoll, down the Oak, it's on West Orchard Avenue. And one of the vineyards is the Butchigaloopis over by the Sonoma County Airport and the Russian River. And the other one was the Alexander Valley Vineyard. So the famous 73 was like 60% Sonoma, actually, of all things. But then they started the AVA system and you couldn't make that anymore. So we switched to only Napa. So this wine is from the west side of the valley. If you're down south, if you know where Laird is, or Tafethin, look off to the west. It's where the Dry Creek of Napa feeds into the Napa Valley. And that's where this one's from. Chemistry-wise, we never did any malolactic because the malic's low enough. So this is still just like the 73, 10% new wood, non-malolactic, basically a single vineyard wine. And we try to keep it as pure as we can. So it's basically, we're always trying to make the Chablis on steroids, or, Burgundy with the California bright fruit and sunlight. And that's where we really focus on, vineyard flavors in our wines, not so much winemaking flavors of the, butyric the malolactic or the oak and buttonage and stirring. So that's happily for us, it's less work. It's kind of minimalist. But our Chardonnay, we've really never changed the style because once we won the Paris tasting, you don't really mess with the success. Remember everybody when McDonald's stopped using beef fat and nobody likes their fries anymore. Same with us on the Chardonnay. It's just really important to have really good, pure, crisp vineyard flavors. And we also like it to make it to age. And we were talking about it. We want our Chardonnay to be like Burgundy. 5 to 7 years is the design on this. So it really comes into balance as the fruit drops off. Then you can pick our minerality. We're growing it in the clay loam of the west side on the alluvial fan of Dry Creek. So really a neat wine, a great spot, but it's essentially a single vineyard wine.
We've had a question about whether or not, in general, Napa Valley is using overall less new oak. And it seems like this is a good question for you, Bo, because you just mentioned that, you haven't used a lot of new oak ever. And I remember one of the great lines, journalists remember these kinds of things, and you probably said it 15 years ago. Maybe you said it to other people beyond me, but you said, oak is like a tattoo. It doesn't always look good with age. And so I don't know if you remember saying that, but it is there are several reasons why one might not use quite as much new oak as Napa Valley vintners did even 10 or 15 years ago.
Okay,
but
I can explain that. I can explain that pretty quickly. When we first, Americans didn't drink wine in the 70s. I don't drink wine. Wine is sour. So in the 80s and 90s, Karen, you probably remember this, is that Americans, they've been drinking 7 and 7 and Jack and Coke their whole life, and then the doctor says you got to drink wine. Americans at that time really liked sweet, and they hadn't been drinking wine. Wine is sour. But then their kids saw them drinking wine, and their kids are our customers now, and they say drink wine. So that way, the pure wine flavors, the European-style flavors come through. And you see guys like Steve Mathiasen and the hardcore minimalists were making very few adaptations of their vineyard flavor. So I think it's a two-pronged thing, but the sweetness of oak was a way to get Americans to drink wine. If you want to credit Clos du Bois or Kendall Jackson or whoever, and I think that the Rombauer, they're making those, country club Chardonnays that made our industry grow and prosper. But there's always been a niche in the market for properly made, handcrafted vineyard, strong flavored wines. And I think that, so it's two things. It's like that the customers actually look for that now, and you can stay in business making wines. I mean, for all through the 80s and 90s, selling this style of Chardonnay was really, really difficult. It wasn't until the third generation of American winemakers or wine drinkers show up where these really pure vineyard flavors and the European style become popular again. So it is essentially a form follows function, natural progression to get back to, now that people love wine and they don't, people like my kids, I've never seen my kids drinking spirits or Jack and Coke or 7 and 7, you know what I mean? So I just think
they have the keys to the cellar.
Get away from the sweetness of it. I think that's the main thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that topic of freshness, and we do have bunches of questions, Bo, about bottle shock and all of that, but I'm just going to, we'll just let you answer those offline privately.
Yeah, the book, read the book.
Yeah, the book was good.
The book is the Judgment of Paris by George Tabor. That's right. If you want to know the story, that's when my dad was still alive. Gergich was still cogent. All the guys who were active in that, all I did was fill the bottles on that one. So the book is very accurate. The movie is a lot of fun, but other than that, and it did pink. Let's just leave it at that.
All right. I want to move now to Mark's wine. We're going to go the Behringer 2000. This is such a joy to have. Thank you, Mark, for bringing us an older wine. This is the Behringer Private Reserve 2000. And it's an interesting segue right from Bo, because I'm going to suggest for Mark and Alicia and Oscar that freshness in Cabernet is also an important idea, right? So Mark, tell us about Private Reserve. I remember when Private Reserve started I was still in New York then, when it was founded, and it was a very big deal when Behringer started their Private Reserve program. Tell us about it and this wine.
Yeah, sure. The Private Reserve Behringer goes back to 1977. And this is when Myron Nightingale was still really in charge of the winemaking here. And he had a young assistant by the name of Ed Sobragia, who had these grand aspirations for what Behringer could become. And had these amazing vineyard sources that just weren't getting really any good play because they were being blended away in these larger blends and really not getting a chance to show themselves. And it kind of evolved out of the original 77, which was 100% from one vineyard. It actually was a single vineyard wine from a vineyard we now call Chabot. For those of you that might know the history, it was actually the Lemon Ranch back in those days. Eventually it was hyphenated Lemon Chabot, and by the 80s it had come out as just the Chabot Vineyard. And it was really the core of the origin of the wine. But by the time we get to the early 80s, we saw this evolution start to happen where we had this portfolio of vineyards start to develop, and a lot of it started to evolve out of the mountains, especially some of our grand vineyards that people know of, like Steinhauer and Bancroft, and also our home ranch right here on the original property. And through the late 80s and into the 90s and to present, we've even expanded it even further. But now it's really about the mountain fruit that really dominates.
Mountains.
Yeah, and because this is a wine that really was built for aging. This is a wine to put into your cellar and have it improve over many years, even decades. In fact, even some of the original wines are still holding up quite beautifully. And so today we brought one that's just a mere 20 years old. It's the 2000.
Beautiful.
And having a chance to try it here earlier, it's amazing how these wines do evolve in the bottle and then also in the glass as they start to open up. This is also one of the unique ones in the portfolio for several reasons. It's a transition year within the company. This is when Ed was passing things off to Lori Hook. This was at the end of Ed's run and essentially was handing it off to Lori to take it on for the next 15 years. I happened to be at Duckhorn Vineyards. That was the year I took over essentially fully from Tom Rinaldi at Duckhorn. So it's kind of one of those really important vintages from both the perspective here and myself. But it's really one of the vintages that was really dominated by mountain fruit. We had a really challenging year in 2000. It was actually a very cool, mild year, had a few heat waves, but I say challenging from the perspective of trying to get things right. We were struggling to the end to get things really to where we wanted them to be. So the valley floor fruit, ironically, had a little bit of a struggle, whereas the mountain fruit actually did better, just through inversion of air and getting a little bit more warming in the mountains. Those actually ripened better. And this wine ended up being 97% from the mountains and only 3% from the valley floor. That's pretty unique in the Behringer history of the private reserve.
Yeah. You know, it's very important, I think, to remember how small the Napa Valley is. Only 5 miles wide at certain points between those mountains. And sometimes you even have mountain soils thrown down on the valley floor. And to me, when you taste the structure of a mountain wine, you know, I always imagine sort of like the Gothic cathedral at Chartres or something, the flying buttresses on the cathedral. It gives the wine such an amazing structure, which you can't always see in a young wine, but with some age, 10 years or more, you really sense the beautiful form of the wine. This is just delicious. None of us get to taste enough old wine these days. I'm sure all the viewers would agree. So this is, and all my panelists here would agree, it's fun to taste, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Hugh is giving you a big thumbs up, or giving the mountains a big thumbs up. That's a gorgeous wine. All right, let's go to Alicia's wine, the Aloft. So Alicia, tell us the relationship between Aloft and Charles Krug, just because this is so I'm going to hold the bottle up. This is Aloft. It's not a Charles Krug wine, but you're the tie between them.
Yeah, correct. So as I mentioned, being 4th generation, my sisters and I cut our teeth in the industry. Starting at the age of 10, each one of us we were required to work in the cellar or the lab every summer from the age of 10 on, and our parents paid us 25 cents an hour, but we clocked in at 8 a.m. and clocked out at 5 p.m. with our hour lunch. So what we thought back then was child labor. Little did we realize we were learning the foundation of the business and work ethic early on. To a default, my sisters and I are workaholics. We enjoy the industry. But we spent all of our extra time sitting down with our grandfather, Peter Sr., and we had the opportunity to have him around until the age of 101. So we learned stories, heard stories, learned any ins and outs of where the industry started and how it evolved over the years. And Aloft really truly became a project that my sisters and I took everything that we had learned over the years. And although it was originally launched under the Charles Krug portfolio, it was the family's first opportunity to introduce a mountain Cabernet Sauvignon. So our father found the property in 2004, 60-acre parcel. We developed 25 acres to Cabernet. And selfishly, we take the best fruit off the property each year, just enough to produce 250 to 400 cases of this
So
wine.
this is your father, Mark, and your sisters and yourself, your separate wine, as opposed to the whole Peter Mondavi senior clan. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, and it's owned by my sisters and myself. So as being the mentor. But Aloft really started our love for Howell Mountain. We now own 3 properties up on Howell Mountain. 2 of the other properties go into a secondary label that my sisters and I launched in 2005 called Dark Matter. And 2008 is when we launched the Aloft label. And it was originally, we were very fortunate to secure Thomas Rivers Brown as our winemaker. He actually handed the reins over to my older sister in 2015. So this is the first vintage. It's also our current release that is made by my older sister, Angelina. And she's actually sitting on the other side of the room right now and waving. And I think I've got a couple sisters and my parents on the Zoom meeting as well today. So we're definitely a family effort. And then Karen, just to call out one of your earlier comments, unintentionally, I think my father and mother raised an executive team because we found each of my sisters and I have different strong suits. So my older sister landed in winemaking, and I geek out on marketing and packaging. And we've got sister number 3, Rihanna, is all sales and works directly with distributors for Charles Krug. And then we do a little distribution of the loft in only a few states, so she helps me with that. And then the younger sister has been residing in Boston and works in finance. So we kind of unintentionally found ourselves different strengths in different departments, and it works great. And that's what excels with the Aloft label. So it has remained 100% single vineyard, single varietal Cabernet Sauvignon, our Howell Mountain property called Cold Springs.
Yeah, and Howell Mountain on the eastern side of the Napa Valley, well known for making quite powerful Cabernets, and the area of Napa Valley where volcanic rock is very dominant, giving the wines, I don't know what I would say it gives the wines, a real gravitas though. This is not for the faint of heart. This wine has real core and statement to it.
It does have the background and how Mountain we ripen and develop about a month behind. So it's not uncommon for us to be picking, be the last ones picking, and we've picked on one of our properties as late as November 7th. So we can pick a little bit later. Yeah, it's a Cabernet background. It's a Howell Mountain Cab, which we've grown.
Let's go to, thank you, Alicia. Let's go to Oscar and the Tres Perlas, which we are tasting last here because it is the 2017, so it's the youngest. We have all these white labels here tonight. Maybe hard to see a little bit, but this is from the Renteria 360 Vineyard in Yountville. And Oscar, I'm curious about, let me hold this up again. What does this, see if I can get that. What does this symbol mean? Circle inside a circle.
Yeah.
Circle.
Inside a circle. Well, it means a couple things. And actually, my father, I think in early 2000s, we wanted to make a wine. We made 1 barrel of a special wine made from the idea that came from Napa Valley Premier, the best of the best that we had, and it was made specifically to be donated for fundraisers. Well, he coined it while we were on vacation in Mexico, called Tres Perlas, because we had three little daughters, and we then adopted that name and came up with three Perlas. But when we were designing this label, the 3 circles for me were primarily first my parents, they being the first generation here, myself, the second generation, and then my daughters, the 3rd generation. So those were the 3 rings. It's pretty interesting is when we had the opportunity to set our feet down in Oakville in these 58 acres called Renteria 360, that we were actually managing this property for a client who was looking to sell it to another client. And since we had the inside track, we were able to get our feet in first. And it just so happened to be that Oakville is in the middle of between, I should say, Yountville and Rutherford, where my mother landed and lived since 1952, and my father's first stepped on Plymouth Rock in Rutherford. It's just a really cool story to see it right in the middle. So it was, it bridged both of those 2 townships, if you will. And so that's really the significance of those 3 circles and generations.
Mm. Oscar, did you yourself get also a degree in winemaking, or are you self-taught?
I am self-taught. As I said, I started working, I should say, my sister, if you were a female of a margarine farm worker, your daughter, 13 years old, and I was 12 years old, and I worked in the vineyard. I worked at the 3 Palm Vineyard for most of my vacations, and so I knew how to prune and tie and pull brush and do a minimal amount of things. And then I really didn't have an appreciation for Napa. I was young. around me, I saw farm workers of my ethnicity. And being young, I wanted to really do my own thing and get away from Napa Valley. I didn't appreciate Napa Valley. And then again, like I said, when my father started his management company, called me, asked me to come home. I wasn't aware he wasn't going to pay me, but he was going to feed me. So I lived with my mom and dad for 5 years after I graduated with my degree. And then was able to learn a lot from my father. It was pretty interesting to be able to learn from my dad and what he was able to do. And to this day, he's still alive and he still gives me some, bit of slack.
Yeah. How fantastic.
So he's wonderful.
Yeah.
So
I'm
I was
sure
able
he's very
to,
proud.
with this, I think he's playing golf today. He said he was going to try to watch, but he plays golf 6 days a week. And that's the love of his life now. But it was always what he called his babies were vines. And I listened to my father, and I know that it was really very difficult to work for my father. He wanted me, he had lots of shoes to fill. When I graduated from college without a degree in viticulture, I was asked by Mr. Steinhauer at Behringer if Sal's son would come and work in the viticulture department. And my dad told Mr. Steinhauer that my son doesn't have a degree in viticulture yet, but he's your son, so I'm sure that blood's got to carry over, and we would love to have you, Sal, as our vineyard manager. So I had a lot of offers when I came back to Napa. I came to work for my father. We started this management company. I bought it in the mid-90s. And to this day, we manage over 2,000 acres, almost 500 employees. We manage 60 different vineyards. But this one in particular, really, it's fairly new for us because in 2013, we were able to purchase the Brown Ranch from Saintsbury. In 2016, this vineyard that was being sold, again, 58 acres in Oakville, to two different wineries. And today we sell to 32 pretty small vintners, including ourselves.
Yeah.
So we take small little bit of our own grapes.
Well, and
Crook,
think about
Behringer is our
Oakville.
winemaker.
We were talking about Howell Mountain earlier. Oakville, one of the most important of the 16 appellations within the Napa Valley, and gosh, lots of famous names are there, right? Screaming Eagle and Harlan and Groth and Farniente, just so many. It's really sort of the heart of the Napa Valley right there in Oakville. Only about 2 miles across the mountains are at that point. So it's Opus One, Mondavi, lots of really great vineyards are right there. Good for you. And the wine is beautiful. Am I the only one who was like, yes, yum, this is delicious.
Thank you to Kirk Bengi. So Kirk, when we were looking for a winemaker for our new brand, which is in 2014, because I managed properties for a lot of folks, a lot of winemakers, and it was a difficult decision to make. But my wife really loved the way Kirk could explain the expression of these wines, and so she, of course, had final decision, as she does in this household. And really, it became my wife's passion. And she really manages this property, but and the wine project. But we were just really fortunate to have Kirk Bengi. It just happened to be my father worked with Niels Bengi in the mid 60s at Sterling when he first came to Napa Valley. So it's really cool to have a legacy of our dads, and now we work together, and he's one of my best friends.
That is very cool. And yes, the Bengi family has been a critically fantastic family.
Yeah.
You're laughing.
We'll leave it there.
I have to ask this question though, that Ellen Gee has posted for all of you, which is what is each guest's favorite wine of the others? So in other words, what is your favorite wine? This is a little unfair. You have to be very diplomatic here. But do you have a favorite wine of your co-panelists?
Can I go first?
Okay, you can go first. Yes, Hugh.
All right, thank you. I'm going to dodge a bullet. I'm going to say the Monolina Chardonnay, right? I love that wine. It's under 14% alcohol. It's Chardonnay. It's lean. It's crisp. It's tart. Back to that dialogue we were having earlier about the East Coast guys thinking that California is Chardonnay. What is it? They may not have drunk it at all before, but now they think it's really high in alcohol and too buttery and oaky, etc. No, this is a really nice California Chardonnay, really nice and beautiful fruit expression. So I'm going to give that one my endorsement today. Otherwise, I'd like all the Cabernets too.
Karen, can I pipe up on that?
Yeah.
I'm not muted anymore. What I wanted to point out, I tried to send you a chat, but I think that when you talked about the Napa Valley being dominated by the mountain AVAs and the valley floor AVAs, I can't think of a better demonstration. The Behringer is a great mountain cab of age. Take away the 20 years, but between the Aloft with that mountain focus and the generosity of the Tres Perlas, I think it is a very outstanding exemplar of the difference between the mountain AVAs have a great sense of presence and balance, and then the valley floor. I just think that this is a brilliant demonstration of the two major Cabernet AVA systems in Napa Valley.
Well,
so that's what I like. So my favorite Krug right now is the Aloft. But we look at Behringer. We always look at our peer group, and the Behringer Private Reserve has always been one. So in our blind tastings and stuff like that. So for me, historically, the Behringer PR has always been my go-to wine from those guys. Yeah. And then I like all of my buddies. I'm big buddies with Steinhauer too, so I always have to support the Taz and the Steinhauer stuff too. But
yeah, we never explained Bob Steinhauer for a very long time, the very famous viticulturalist of Behringer Vineyards. So we want to just state who Steinhauer is. Alicia, you want to go? What's your favorite wine on the table?
Definitely a loaded question. My palate, in all honesty, is I can open up a bottle of bubbles and sit with it and enjoy it hands down every single day with every single meal. So
you should.
Yeah, I know. Half my family, we're all club members of Schramsberg because it's just a go-to. We absolutely love every single bottle that we always get. So my palate gravitates, of course, unintentionally towards Schramsberg. That being said, though, Behringer, all my memories that I've had with my grandfather, and I might not be exaggerating when I say I could have been bottle-fed Behringer as a baby, and alongside some of our Charles Krug stuff. It was not uncommon for especially my older sister and I, and Brianna, the sister number 3. We would always enjoy family meals with my grandfather and our parents, and we always got a little tumbler glass. It was half water, half wine, and that's how we got introduced to it. And I know my parents say basically starting from the age of 4, and if we were good, that was our little treat that we got with dinner. And it was not uncommon for Behringer or Charles Krug to be in that lineup, so that one brings a lot of memories to the table. For me, so. Because
for viewers who are with us, you could almost throw a baseball between maybe some of you actually could throw a baseball. I don't think I could. Yep, I knew you could. Okay, some of you can throw a baseball between these two historic properties. All right, let's see, Mark. We didn't ask you what your favorite wine is here. You can't choose the Behringer, of course, but.
Well, I could because I didn't make it, right? So
clever.
But, I've got to give everybody credit for an amazing lineup here. I mean, I don't think any of us drink enough bubbles in our lives, so I really love Hugh. The sparkling wine is just, stellar. Schramsberg is iconic around here, and I love it. But I have to say, Bo, your Chardonnay is so classic, and it's been such a tradition in that style that it just never disappoints. But it's really fascinating for me to see the new projects, what you're doing with Aloft, Lesia, with Oscar, what you're doing. It's really cool to see new upcoming stuff that's, going to be the next generation of this valley. Because, with the way things are going, everybody thinks it's going to go corporate and everything's getting bought up, and there's a lot of that going on. But at the end of the day, it's that regeneration, it's that next stuff that's coming out, the innovation that's going to be really cool. So I love to see your 2 projects, and they're just both beautiful wines. So I got to throw it to you two for stepping up and making these new products that are just really blowing it out upon.
Beautifully said. And Oscar, your favorite?
Oh boy. Well,
I know.
Since I had
Mark is running for political office, by the way.
Yeah, he did a great job.
He did such a diplomatic job, didn't he? Okay.
He did.
Mark, we're voting for you. All right.
Yeah, absolutely. You're in. Well, because my wife is on my left over here, and she's a white wine drinker, and we always have champagne. So Mark, we're in the champagne and white wine. So those are the two that my wife prefers. And the first wine that made an impact to me that has, I would say, my heart would be the Behringer, because the wine that made the biggest impression growing up for me was the 1982 Private Reserve. And I still remember tasting it. I went through the tasting room and went with my father to taste wines. So Behringer always will have a heart, and of course, Mr. Steinhauer as well. Alicia, I think a loft, because I have 3 daughters, and I hope that someday they will go into the business that has my soul. And so, sorry, I don't mean to run for office either, but what a beautiful expression of a new wine, and what incredible expression of a wine that's aged. I was born in Celine. I can't choose between. I'm sorry, they're just wonderful. So what my wife likes, the Chardonnay and the Schransberg.
You're getting cues off camera here. I can see.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I guess we have several questions coming in about my favorite. This is, I was going to say hard to do, but not hard to do actually, because Hugh may know, been friends for a long time, that I drink a glass with bubbles in it every single night, and have for 20 years. Usually California or Champagne, sometimes Cava or Prosecco, but usually California or Champagne. I wasn't kidding about there being like a Schramsberg area in the refrigerator right over here. I'm coming to you from my kitchen. Because I think that great Method Champenoise sparkling wine is the single best deal there is going. This wine costs the equivalent of $7 a glass, maybe $8 a glass. I know people who spend more than that every day in Starbucks. I want to come home and have a glass of sparkling wine every night before I go on to maybe other things, or maybe stay with it through the evening. So Oscar, I'm with your wife on that. Chardonnay, Beau's Chardonnay is so important to me because, there are only a few A++ Chardonnays. There are a C of B- Chardonnays out in the world at this point. Not everybody has a long track record in California of producing really beautiful, linear, elegant, Audrey Hepburn-esque Chardonnay. It took courage to continue to make this style when everybody else was making Kim Kardashian kinds of Chardonnays. So thank you, Beau, for continuing to make Chardonnay that some of us feel like this, is the original Chardonnay. With Napa Valley Cabernet, of course, it's Napa Valley's such a strong suit for Napa Valley now. And so when I taste this Behringer, I think to myself, oh my God, when in the early days, we all remember, right? In the early days, people said, Napa Valley Cabernet, okay, it tastes good now, but it won't age. You taste this wine and you think, wait a minute. Not only does this wine taste younger than it is, but I'm going to say it has years and years and years. It's a very alive wine, years and years in front of it. The product of really great Napa Valley vineyards and careful winemaking, and just that beautiful integration that comes from age only. You can't fake that. You can't do that. It either is there or it isn't. For the Aloft, Howell Mountain I look across at Howell Mountain, and every morning and every night I see how it is just immersed in this incredible luminosity. You're going to get this beautiful ripe fruit, but you're also going to get mountain kinds of mountain structure. So this Aloft seems to me to be just like, oh, there it is, Howell Mountain in a glass. So Alicia, congratulations on that. And then I have to say about the Tres Perles, which means 3 pearls. I think I got that right, Oscar? Has to mean 3 pearls. Your little daughters were the three pearls as far as Salvatore was concerned. There's a kind of, I don't know, green. I think this wine would have confused me. Had this been put in a lineup of Bordeaux, I might have guessed Bordeaux. There's a kind of green tobacco-y character here that is so delicious and sensual. It's not just sort of cherry fruit. It has a kind of complexity that I think Napa Valley often gets to, and it goes beyond fruit. It's all of these other kinds of flavors of the brush in the mountains, the dry forests of California, the savoriness of Cabernet. So this is the first time I'm tasting this wine.
Me too.
I know all the others really well, but this is my first time with this wine. So I have to write a really long note to myself, so I remember it well.
Very well.
So everyone, we are, all of these live virtual tastings, or as we all might refer to them now as LVTs, my God, a new word in our whole vocabulary, usually go for about an hour, but we've had such a great time. It's way past that. And we thank all of you who have been with us this whole time and staying on and tasting these wines. And if you haven't tasted some of these wines, I personally encourage you to go out and buy a bottle. You could replicate this tasting actually very easily. Just jump on wine.com or another site and buy the wines, or buy them direct from the wineries. Or buy, sorry, thank you. Wait a minute, wait,
whoa, yeah, hold on,
buy them direct from the wineries.
Lady.
Yeah, okay, missed that moment, sorry. Thank you, Bo, for that correction. But my point is going to be that every single one of these wines is, I think, worthy of your thoughts and you tasting. They are really delicious wines, and wines that we had hoped when we began to conceive this live virtual tasting, that we would choose wines that would delineate moments in history and moments of importance, of flavor that define the Napa Valley. So I think if you buy these wines, any one of them, or all of them preferably, you'll find that they really do, in this beautiful way, encapsulate Napa Valley right at this moment. For my part, I'm Karen MacNeil. I'm the author of the Wine Bible and the editor of WineSpeed. And I thank all of you for joining us. I thank all of my panelists. We did pretty good, guys, right?
Thank you.
It was good.
Thank you.
I'm good for the day.
Bye, everyone.
Time for
Thank
lunch.
you.
Time for lunch. All right, so long, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.